We can hear you fine with it now. I can hear you coming over the speaker.
Okay, then they should be able to hear me.
If they can, I'll let you know.
Please let me know. So I was given a very difficult topic, in my opinion. It's a topic that I struggled with how to teach it to everyone because I think it takes a lot of experience living it to get your arms around it. So the concept behind my presentation is to really walk you through it. I highlighted what I thought, because it was in the book, would be a key point. So you'll see that called out in my presentation. I put things in red that were my opinions, my thoughts, and I'll elaborate on those, but I just will make sure it's very clear that I'm not speaking from some sort of knowledge in the textbook, that this is on-hands pieces to it. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Kimberly Culp, and I am the Executive Director with LEDA, and do I need to email myself? Can't see where I'm clicking. Now I probably messed up your old computer. Let's see, is it gonna go? There we go. So here's my background. I've been in the field for 21 years, actually in my 22nd now, and I've held every position in dispatch that you can imagine. Prior to LEDA, I was a civilian division chief over all the civilian divisions at Golden Police Department, and then came up here at the end of '06, chaired the task force for 3 years, then the statewide 911 task force. And then in my education, I've got 2 master's degrees and various different certifications in different areas of police and leadership work. I have listed up there the END certifications. Those have all expired, but I did have them at one point with the National Academy, so understanding the National Academy END process, the EMDQ process, etc. I just didn't keep up on them because I'm not hands-on END. So I told myself I wasn't going to teach off of a PowerPoint and we wouldn't have death by PowerPoint, and I ended up with 30 slides, so we may. But the point that I want you to think about when we talk today is single point of failure and how critical a single point of failure is. So when we go through all of the different scenarios of what you can lose, you're really talking about loss or creating a single point of failure in your infrastructure. And that's always a bad thing. And I guarantee you right now you have a single point of failure somewhere. We thought we were pretty good, and we found out in the fall of 2013 we had so many single points of failure, some in our control, a lot outside of our control. So we're going to kind of highlight that as well. So hopefully none of you will die in my presentation. I'm slotted for 2 hours. I anticipate only going an hour. But the format I like to have is to talk through things as a dispatcher's background way too fast. So slow me down, back me up, and ask questions as I go through points. Don't save until the end. So, and I'll be asking you questions as well. So this is the definition of single point of failure. And it's a risk, it's a flaw, and that's the key to really think about. A single point of failure is some sort of risk or flaw in your design, whether it's your radio system, whether it's the stuff outside of your control on the other side of the network, and we're going to call that the demarcation of a demarc. That's kind of the line of what's yours and what's theirs. Okay, so a lot of what's in the manual is on that side of the demarc. We're talking about the stuff that we really can't control from a big picture perspective, at least in Colorado. The other piece about your manual and your test, and you probably know this, is that they are not Colorado specific. So if you have a question about, okay, well, what does that look like for Colorado? I'm happy to answer that and take the time for it, but just, I think that's what I struggled with a lot when I took the test, was I knew Colorado, but I didn't think specific or generic enough. So I'll just kind of let you keep that in mind. So I want you to think about, and I challenge all of you, again, this is outside of the scope of what this study session is how many single points of failure do you have in your system right now? All of your systems. Your voice logger system, your radio system, your Viper system. How many single points of failure do you have? See if you can find them collectively as an organization. And then, in light of what we're talking about, how would you fix it? And the term that they would use would be, how would you mitigate that? So as we're kind of talking through this, see, and maybe on a column of your paper, you would take notes and you would write that down and go ding, 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 you know, we may have a problem here. Okay, I'll give you an example of a problem we have for a current single point of failure, and that's with our voice logging system. Can they hear me? Are they? Okay.
I just asked if they can hear you and I haven't got anything back, so,
We're gonna assume we're good.
yeah, until they say otherwise, we'll,
Okay,
keep
so
going.
from our voice logger perspective, we've got 5 PSAPs, and we have a voice logger installed at each of those PSAPs. The audio sits on those loggers, so if we were to lose anything of that logging unit, because of the way the system works in the hard drive, we have potential of losing some of our audio. So we've identified, I mean, it's just thinking of that, do you have a redundant system? So think about all of your different pieces of equipment and your people, your resources. Or does only one person do your mapping, your GIS, your NSAG? That can also create an issue. So keep that in mind as we talk through everything. The topics that we are going to cover, you can tell it's a lot, but we're going to take it in small bites. We're going to talk about the contingency and different types of disasters, the phases of emergency management. My disclaimer here is I am not an emergency manager, and I haven't gone through emergency management formal training except for all those lovely classes that you can take with your different levels. So if you haven't taken the 100 and on up and done the 700, Nina states in the book they're pulling material from FEMA, emergency management, all those websites. So you've got to take some time and click through that. You don't have to become an expert in it, but Nina calls out that you need to be looking at that. So we're going to go through those phases of emergency management. We're also going to go through the categories of service interruption. This is a piece that I think is the most confusing and difficult to get your arms around. So again, I called out here what I think a key point is for your studying, and that is to look at the FEMA concepts of integrated emergency management. Higher? They can't hear me? Okay. So that key point is, again, not for you to become an emergency manager, but you will have questions on the test that are outside of this book, and they call it out very specifically. We are pulling this information from FEMA. Okay, so you just go to FEMA.org or gov and take a look at that. The other thing I wanted to point out is the book I'm using to work off of to pull this together. So my presentation, it pulls from the data page 100 because it's the last revision from September of 2013. If your book is the one before that, it's page 96 now or 94?
91.
91. Okay, so I tried to reference some page numbers if you wanted to kind of keynote in your book and take notes there. So we're going to dive into the types of disasters. So I'm going to bounce just slightly in your book. Did you not find it? So it's actually called in your book Hazards Analysis. So in my book it was 100, and on Val's book, who does not have the September 13th date, it's 92. Okay. So my opinion, so it's in red, my opinion is the first step in emergency is you quickly gather an initial assessment, meaning you have to quickly decide what do we have in front of us today. What is this? Is it caused by a natural event? And I'm going to show you some pictures of our 2013 flood. I know you guys were flooded as well, but wanted to incorporate in here a little bit of a practical, here we go. This is my 911 fiber in Highway 34 Canyon. So that's where my fiber was, and you can imagine we lost it. So we had to quickly assess what do we have on our hands, what type of threat was this? Here's another shot of what that fiber looks like from overhead. The whole road was gone, and this is just one piece. I mean, we lost that entire canyons, and we lost it, but that fiber being exposed is pretty powerful. We had the High Park fire as well, so all these initial assessments of what was it. That was a natural disaster with the High Park fire, and what impacted Wild and Larimer was that Windsor tornado that actually jumped the highway. This is a picture from the highway as that tornado was crossing over. The other types of disasters, if you're not dealing with these natural environmental disasters, would be related to something like an aircraft problem. We have, they list it, and Nina, they talk about explosions, some sort of localized contamination, hazardous spill, or loss of power. This is a picture from Glenhaven. So when we had our floods, we actually lost everything in that community as well, but they took this is the CenturyLink phone line dangling from the tree, and ran it into their fire station just so they could turn up a landline phone. So I had to get a picture of that. The other types of disasters Nina discusses, they don't go into a lot of detail, but also some sort of incited disaster, your arsons, your strikes, your sabotage. We had a strike threat not too long ago, which from CenturyLink employees, I think it was before the merger of Quest and CenturyLink, and a lot of us came together and said, who's gonna support our systems if they went on strike? And it was the 911 folks in Minnesota that were complaining, so who's gonna monitor, who's gonna respond, and that could easily be an event of a disaster for you if you've got nobody there watching or helping or responding. And I hope this looks as scary as I thought it did yesterday. The other was the Manmade, and they say most of your outages are something like this. We've had 2 recently. One of them was a backhoe cable cut, and it happened in Drake. They were trying to rebuild the infrastructure that we lost, and they cut a local cable to that entire community, and we had a loss of service from the citizen to the dispatch center. The dispatch center was fine. We also had a loss at the dispatch center when a backhoe cut another cable, our fiber, for our 911 system. And the other one I want to put down here is your circuit overload. What is your central office capacity? So when you talk about a type of a disaster, man-made, is we or our citizens, our lovely citizenship, could create a disaster by doing either on purpose an overload of the circuits, by everybody going off hook and dialing, trying to create a disaster. We specifically discussed that for our campus, for Colorado State University, and something you guys may have at UNC are call boxes. So across the campus we have call boxes. At one point they were programmed into 911, so they would actually go off hook and call in on our 911 trunk. And we thought, oh my gosh, if everybody went off hook right at that same time, they're gonna fill those 911 trunk lines, and if they're full, they roll over to the county, and if they're full, they roll over to Fort Collins, and we just created this situation. There's a potential that by students creating some sort of purposeful event, they could have taken down all of our PSAPs and overloaded the system and really crashed 911. So those are the types of disasters, those categories that Nina wants you to be thinking about. The second step when you have a disaster is, so you're thinking immediately about the type, it's to determine the extent and how impacting it is. So when we talk about local, regional, PSAP network facilities, the key point I call out here for you is that Nina recommends public safety agencies and telephone service providers. That's the language they use, but it's really more than just your phone service providers, because we've got our BESP in Colorado, but it would be your providers. Think about providers generically to work together and share those contingency plans. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't imagine CenturyLink handing over their contingency plan to me when they have disasters, but they have shared various key points with us, and then we build contingency plans around that. So something to be thinking about in a key point is they're talking about the cooperation and to incorporate from other vendors, other providers into your own emergency operations plan. So there could be questions around that. How do you build your operations plan through cooperation with all these different resources? So something for you guys to take away for your agencies is, did you do that? Did you look at your operations plan and say, I'm going to respond A, B, and C, and we've done that, and we know that it is in line with our expectations from these different providers. So Nina points out, when you look at the FEMA websites, and what Nina's referencing is that you need to know who to contact, request their contingency plans, and understand their escalation paths. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about our experience. When we lost all communications in Estes Park, and we're talking we lost every bit of communication you can have in Estes Park, we were following the normal channels to get this to work and to try and bring everything back up. So contacting CenturyLink, escalating it to the same folks that you'd be escalating it to for a service situation, saying, hey, we're down, we're out, we need assistance, that didn't get us anywhere. So I ended up calling the president of AT&T, Bill Swords, because I had a professional relationship with him from working on point of sale legislation a few years ago, explained to him how dark we were, even on a cell phone side, and they drove a truck over from Arizona and stood it up and was able to get us communication. I called my contact with Verizon, who also worked with me on the point of sale legislation, and they helicoptered folks in and stood up wireless service. We had wireless service stood up within 36 hours of us going dark, which was a huge accomplishment for those two providers, because as landlines struggle, the wireless, it's not all just in the sky, you know, there's that landline connection there as well. So the key point here is, even though as you build your contingency plans, you need to know your escalation paths, and you need to know and have and build those relationships before an emergency. So if you need to reach out and touch someone, you know who to go and what channel to go to.
When did you get help from CenturyLink?
We actually did not have condition for routing in place. We lost services on Wednesday, and we didn't have condition for routing in place until 11 p.m. on Friday. So condition for routing was, we didn't have 911 back until Monday. So help from CenturyLink, I think, is one of those, what does that mean from a loose term perspective? Were they on it? Were they responding? Yes. Did they show up and helicopter folks in and throw us the lifeline? No. But they also had, you know, big picture. So did AT&T and Verizon. Wild County, they had Boulder County. You know, we had this large disaster that impacted a whole region and multiple regions. Oh. Back up. All right, so the next piece, so we've defined our disaster, we designed the type, right? We figured out what we think the type is, and we figured out the impact, or at least an initial assessment of the impact. What Nina wants you to focus on and understand, and this is that emergency management perspective, are these different phases of emergency management. So this is on page 100 if you were following that same book that I was. And there are actually 4 phases of emergency management. And this is a little, I don't know, this is not in your book, okay? This is not in your book, but on 100 they reference for you to go to FEMA, go to their website and look this information up. So this is pulled from FEMA, so that's why it can be kind of confusing. And you will have a question or two about this on the test. And it's okay to say that, right? Hint, hint. So the first step is mitigation. So the key point about mitigation is that we call it the first step, but it really happens in its activities that happen before and after an emergency. So mitigation is designed to limit the impact. Anybody have an example that you can give me about what mitigation would be? And those folks online too, if you want to type an example, Daryl's watching. What would mitigation look like?
Would that be like having a backup center?
Yes.
I don't know if you heard me on the line.
So Debbie said like having a backup center. That's correct?
Training on what to do.
Training. Fires, we talk a lot about cutting down trees, you know, clearing that safe boundary around your property, at least around your buildings. That would be considered mitigation. There's also sometimes a big public education campaign about keeping your lights on at night, about closing your garage doors, especially if there's a lot of burglaries in the area, so that's considered mitigation. Anything else? I know your center's too big to ever work alone, but there are some centers out there that still have only a solo dispatcher working, and that a mitigation plan would be we will never allow one dispatcher to work at a time because something could happen to that individual in the community that one person couldn't handle. So mitigation would be developing policies as well. Any other ideas about mitigation? So keep in mind on this one is it happens before and after emergencies. So even though that picture is really circular, you know, mitigation, it's more before and after. I look at it a little bit more linear and put that in the beginning and the end. Okay, the next step is preparedness. And preparedness is all activities geared toward planning and preparing for that emergency. So this would include plans to evacuate. It would include plans on how to staff during emergencies, like staff callback. So the key point is preparedness happens before an emergency. So different than mitigation, where mitigation you have moved the trees, you've cut the trees around. In preparedness, here in a dispatch center, this could be your policies, the fact that you have an emergency alert system, or what we would call an emergency notification system, having your supplies in place, having your testing done, maybe training and testing to make sure that everybody is up to speed on what those policies are, they know how to implement them, having mutual aid agreements in place, this would be part of preparedness. So between Weld County and Larimer County, what kind of mutual aid agreements, or do we have an intergovernmental agreement, an IGA in place? You know, so it's really being prepared, going, okay, I'm trying to anticipate and predict, and then I'm going to be prepared by working through all of these items and have them all set up. Okay. The response is pretty clear. I think this is the one that's the clearest of all the steps, and that's obviously how you respond to the emergency. So the key point here that Nina wants you to know is that response is putting your preparedness plans into action. So all those things that you decided that you were going to be prepared with and that you did, it's taking those into action and then having an activity of response. So you take your preparedness plans and you actually are putting them into action. They also discuss slightly NIMS, or incident management. So I'm not telling you that you need to read up and become really familiar with all of that, but think about, I think fire departments do NIMS the best, and I think they do incident management the best, of saying, hey, we're gonna have one person who is the command and controller that does the IC, they are the incident commander, and understand kind of how all of that flows through. So you wanna look on that FEMA website and just kind of take a look and familiarize yourself enough that you get the terms that they're talking about, okay? Again, we're not expecting you to be an emergency manager, but they do reference that. Response makes sense to everyone? All right. So recovery would be all the activities taken to return to a normal or even a safer situation. So recovery doesn't mean that it's all done. It's just those steps that you're taking to be a safer situation. So when we're in recovery, would be it's happening after the emergency, it may be happening for a long period of time after the emergency. So the water stopped rising. Okay, now we're in the recovery phase. So we're still responding to emergency, but we're starting to recover now. We're trying to rebuild, we're restoring services. We don't have all the services restored. We don't have 911 landline restored, but we've got wireless 911 restored. So those are your recovery phases. Okay, so now you're kind of in that recovery mode. You're trying to rebuild. Hey, what time are we at? Are we doing okay?
We are at 1:26.
Okay, is everyone still doing okay? I know that's a lot of information and now we kind of shift gears. So I'm gonna pause right here and I'm gonna ask everybody if you have any questions about these phases or any other discussion or anything you want me to circle back on. Because this part in the manual is truly not covered thoroughly. They expect you to do additional looking it up and research on it. Makes sense? Can you think about your policies internally, and do you have some of these phases outlined? Okay, we're gonna have a staff callback, so we have a policy on how to do a staff callback. We've had to do a staff callback because you were impacted by the floods. You know, can you kind of think that was your response? Your preparedness was probably creating the policy. Your mitigation was purchasing the equipment to use. I'm not sure what system you use, but can you kind of see, and then your recovery would be, okay, now your community's recovering, dispatch is back to normal status, getting time off, you're taken off of mandatory 12s, for example. So does that kind of flow? Okay. All right. I think it's rather a little bit confusing, but I'm glad you all are good. All right, so this is the part that I have, and I don't have for those that aren't here, so you guys do miss out on it, but for some reason, if you want this, you could probably print it from your screen. This is what we're gonna be going over after we get there. So everybody should have at least one. You may want more, because I'm gonna go through scenarios, and you're gonna wanna mark them up, or you may want to mark them up. You may wanna mark them up and take notes on it. I don't do cloud stuff because it annoys me. So I actually have lines. This does not mean lines in the ground by any means. But we're gonna go through categories of service interruption. And there's actually 8, and this is on page 101 if you're in my manual. There's actually 8 listed in your book. I put them in 5 groups. And the other EMPs in the room, if you want to start yelling at me, going, okay, really, you really need to break these out, feel free to add value to the conversation. I'm not saying I'm right, I just, in my head, grouped them differently. So there's 8 in your book. I grouped them into 5 categories. So the first one is your PSAP loss of service. We're going to go through all these in details. Second one is your central office, and there's a definition there. The central office piece, it's what connects the lines, your 911 trucks, to your PSAP. And that may be your demarc point, right? So kind of circle back on that. And your end office is a type of a central office. This is a key that connects the customers into the 911 network, but does not directly connect into your PSAP. And there's also standalone and remote end offices. And I'm going to go through lots of examples of this, so I don't expect it all to make sense right now. We also are going to cover the loss of a tandem switcher, selective router, and the loss of a database alley circuits. Now, your earlier presentation, I'm referring to Daryl's, hit on a lot of this stuff and a lot of terms. So this should all be, hey, no-brainer to all of you. And if my drawings and pictures are too basic, Daryl's presentation on week 3 or 4, I want to say, has a lot of detail. So it has more steps in there, like customer routes to here, and really gets into heavy detail. I'm painting big picture so the concepts flow a little bit different. Okay. So we've got our template. So for those that are joining us on the phone, this is the template that we're going to be working on throughout, and so you'll keep seeing the different pieces, and you can print it out and follow along, or just follow along on the website. All right, so the first category of service interruption is the loss, full or partial loss of a PSAP. And this is actually covered on page 103 in your manual. So can you think of what would make you lose a PSAP?
Natural disaster.
We almost lost Estes Park's PSAP, and we had water that was rising. The chief was texting me because text was working sporadically, telling me there's so much water in the parking lot, it is like a river flowing through and around their building. And we took water in the building, so we actually had water coming in where all the equipment was. So we almost lost Estes Parks, not only with the PSAP, but the police department, town hall, library, that whole building. So natural disaster. What else?
Power outage of any kind.
Yep, that can do it. You can lose a PSAP if you also have that scary backhoe that can cut if you have connectivity. Yeah, you can also lose your PSAP if you have the connection to your PSAP cut as well. So Nina talks specifically about evacuation of a PSAP on page 110. They also refer in their manual to the Nina standards that cover measures that need to be in place for an evacuation. They don't expect you to memorize all of those, just be familiar with them, and they're not in your book. They're expecting you to go to their website and browse that material and take a look at it. So that's specifically found on Nina's website. So when you think about, okay, if we lost this building, are we okay? You guys have a backup PSAP. So you're okay, but what do you do until you get to that continuity of operation? Is something from a personal perspective you need to think about. From our perspective, what we thought, and I'll tell you a little bit more from a reality perspective, is Estes Park wasn't a standalone PSAP, they were networked together. So if we lost that building, we were going to be okay. We would be fine, we could still pick up the services. So, which wasn't the case. So the key terms here that you want to think about would be that business continuity plan. And those are your guidelines to ensure that your mission critical emergency operations can continue during a crisis. So it's called a business continuity plan. So at any given time you could lose a PSAP. You may lose this facility, fire, flood, natural disaster, tornado. What are you going to do when you lose a PSAP? Can your citizens still dial 911 and get help? Administrative lines. Do you have a backup plan for your administrative lines? Can you do a regular 10-digit inbound, outbound? Do you have enough cell phones? I mean, another, just, kind of be thinking about the big picture. So we've talked about you may lose the facility or you may lose that connectivity right in front of the facility, basically, and then you've lost that facility because if you can't get communication in, you've actually lost that. All right. So the second category would be an isolation of a central office. Now, I drew a circle around this instead of a red X because it doesn't mean the central office is gone. It didn't blow up or flood or fire, but it's isolated. And that means that central office cannot communicate. The central office serving the PSAP is a better way to say it, cannot communicate outside of the central office. It means that I'm on my island, and kind of picture this island effect. So this round circle is your little island. And the central office says, I can only communicate, I'm isolated, I'm on my island, I can only communicate to those of you that have joined my island. Okay, that is your service interruption, isolation of a central office. Okay, it means that the central office can't talk to the selective router database. Okay, because selective router database is not on the island. It's down in Denver, in Colorado. It's Capitol Hill and Broomfield, that for our purposes. What can happen when you have a central office isolation is you can have what we call condition 4 routing, meaning that central office says, if you're on my island, I can talk to you if you are local to me, meaning you joined me on my island. So if you give me a 10-digit number that is local to my central office, meaning it's a CenturyLink for us, it'd be a CenturyLink phone number, it would be the same phone number that is served by that central office, I can talk to you because you're on my island. So if I'm isolated and you're a citizen and you place a 911 call until this lifeline is drawn, and this is condition 4 routing, I can't talk to you. But once this is established, I can route 911 calls to a PSAP, and that's called condition 4 routing. So citizens still dial 911, they don't have to dial the 10-digit, they still dial 911. You receive it on a 10-digit phone number. You receive it on that 10-digit phone number. So condition 4 routing should be part of that contingency preparedness plan. You should know what that number is, and that number should be given over to that telephone provider responsible for plugging it in and programming it here at the central office.
Do you guys know what that number is? Oh, good. Because then you might get calls from CenturyLink for that number. So everybody should know it.
And in some cases, and I'll come back to that, remind me to talk about what happens if that isn't in your building. Because there's some cases that phone line may not be able to ring here because you may not be on the island, your PSAP may not be on that island. Okay, so I'll demonstrate that. Here's what's interesting. In a central office isolation, you won't be able to dial long distance. You can still dial 911 if that condition 4, that orange line is drawn. You can dial your friends that are family that are on that island with you, that are served by the same central office. But if they have a different telephone service provider, they're not local to that central office, they're not going to reach them. So it's going to feel very much like a complete outage, and it's truly an isolation. Okay, so when we were isolated and we became a condition 4 routing in Estes Park, we were still getting reports, so this is where we started getting very confused. My phone service doesn't work, I can't reach anyone. We didn't ask enough to say, what number did you try to dial? Who were you trying to reach? It was, my service is still out. It was, they were isolated. So they had a little bit of recovery in place, and they had a little bit of their service restored. Make sense, okay? Your little island? Alright.
So just announcing via your local media that service is restored, citizens expected that everything's gonna work.
Right, so you can't say, hey, services are restored, everything's working. It's we're working on services. You can dial 911 and you'll be able to reach your local 911 center. At this time, you may or may not be able to reach.
Your friend.
Right. And what we kept telling people during that disaster was, please don't call anybody because you're overloading the little bit of infrastructure we were standing up. Please don't take pictures and text those pictures of the flood to your friends and family because you're overloading the little truck that AT&T drove over Trailbridge, and now we can't even make the basic cell phone call. So media, again, how are you gonna get the word out though, because everything's down. But that should be part of your preparedness plan, is how can you reach citizens and get those different messages out.
Do they have boundaries defined for those central office islands?
They do. And CenturyLink, based on a 911 diversity docket that I opened, has agreed to share those with you if you sit with them and sign a non-disclosure agreement. So it's very important, if you have not done that in Weld County or anybody else that has joined us, for you to do that. Find out this information I'm going to share you right now too, your boundaries of your central office, but then also your boundaries of your end office to know who your end offices serve.
Can I tell a little story, Kimberly?
Yes, please, but you're going to have to come up here, don't tread.
Actually, I'm close enough to the mic they can hear me. My last job was as a PSAP manager in Farmington, New Mexico. It's the very northwest corner of New Mexico, just south of Durango. We had an isolation event, and I don't know if you had this experience, Kimberly, but we had people calling us very upset because credit card machines weren't working. The internet was out for a lot of people, and gas pumps weren't working if they were trying to use credit card to pay for their gas, because anything that had to communicate with the outside world was completely cut off. And so that was a large portion of our calls during that time. Was there was a huge sale at the mall that day, and they couldn't process their credit card payments. Like, well, we have bigger issues right now, but that was one of the big concerns. So when we're talking about an isolation event, we really are talking about, it's almost like that community is cut off from the rest of the world.
And when I attended a amazing conference and got to listen to the former FEMA director during the hurricanes that impacted Louisiana, and he said it was advertised everywhere that we were out of gas. We had no gas. It wasn't that we didn't have gas. We had plenty of gas. But we had cash to pay for the gas because we were isolated to the outside world as it relates to phone service. So because people didn't keep cash on hand and have cash to go in and say, hey, once they restored the power to pump the gas, they didn't have a way to pay and process because nobody carried cash. So his big thing was, how much cash do you have at hand, on you, or accessible by your fingertips without going to an ATM, because that's not going to work either. So it was a really interesting part of a preparedness perspective. Me personally, as an individual, I've never learned more from that hour of the keynote speaker in my entire life as I did, going, wow, that was an amazing perspective. So thanks for adding that.
So that means PSAP should have cash for whatever they need to do during emergency, even buying the PSAP.
Right, I would agree. Yeah, I would agree. Even if you need to go feed your
That's
folks.
my group.
Yes, for a cash box. Right.
I like you.
All right, we're going to talk about an end office isolation or service interruption. So remember, the end office doesn't connect directly to your PSAP. So at one point, our end office used to connect to our PSAP, but we moved our demarcation point. In the national NINA book, it says an end office does not connect to your PSAP. So that's a little bit what can be confusing, because our Colorado model is a bit different in some cases. So an isolation of an end office is when an end office that feeds the 911 system cannot communicate to the Tandem or the Selective Router database. So calls from that area will not reach the PSAP, and again, you could be on a condition for routing if that happens. So it's not a lot different than a central office isolation. So right here, from an end office isolation, if this is, it's the same thing, I'm an island, and until you can get to me and establish that 10-digit, I think that's an orange line I drew, see this orange line right there, until you can get to me and establish that condition for routing, service isn't gonna work, and once you get that established, I can dial 911 again, and I will be directed to a 7-digit number, but it has to be local to this end office, okay? Any questions on that piece?
Okay. Can you use both central office and end office?
You
And-
can,
And do you need both those condition fours from each one established?
you would.
Okay.
So the question was, can you lose a central office and an end office? And we were close to losing both. So in our scenario, central office located in Loveland, end office located in Estes Park. And we isolated this end office, we easily could have isolated this central office. And then both of those PSAPs would have been on a condition 4 route instead of just one. Easily can happen in a large scale disaster. So for all PSAPs, for all end offices, for all central offices in your area, you should have those numbers identified and programmed. And we're gonna talk about what reality is here in Colorado as well, so you understand that. It states in your book it should be automatic, so if you provide that number and you're working with your provider, it's gonna be automatic and programmed in your central office. Locally, my advice is that you ask the question, is it something automatic, or do you actually have to have a person who goes and looks at that number and have to get there to program it to make that routing happen, okay? You would expect it to be automatic, and I believe Nina writes the word automatic in the book. All right,
So you're saying condition 4 routing is automatic, we don't have to manually do it?
so what happens in reality is you being your agency decides what number is local to that central office or that end office. So you have to know, has to be 970-635, it has to be local to that number scheme, so it's local to that office. You give that number to your provider, and they are supposed to program it in the brains at the central office and the end office. So if your 911, if that office is isolated from the selective router, right here, coming down this blue, if you're isolated here, or you're isolated here and you can't get down to the selective router, a condition 4 can automatically happen,
Okay.
okay? It should be automatic. In some cases, it's not. Okay, in our case, it was not. CenturyLink never programmed our condition 4 numbers in,
Okay.
okay?
And how are you aware when it's
A
not?
disaster happens,
Okay, obviously.
right? I mean, because of course we provide all that information, of course you can do testing, of course you can do all that stuff, and you think, and you have to draw some safe partnerships where you say, I have to trust you and you have to trust me that you know, because that's their side of the demarc, right? My side of the demarc is I'm giving you the number, their side of the demarcation is what is programmed in that office. So I can't get into that office and verify. You can get all the verification you want, but until you're really isolated, you're not sure how it's gonna operate.
So when you have them routing to a specific number, is it limiting you to one line then?
Depends on how you set that up. One call in, one call out. So what you can do, and this is what we've done at all of our PSAPs, is we've got, or PSAPs that are impacted by the central office or an end office. We have a number, I have a number identified that's local, and it routes to that other number that's local to that end office or that central office, and on the end of it, you can have a phone that could take perhaps additional lines associated with it. So maybe that's the first line in a hunt group.
Okay.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's it depends on where it goes. Now I've got one end office that is in a remote area that the only thing local to it is the local fire station. So it may route to a fire station, and we actually have to get a body over there to answer the call. And your manual actually talks a little bit about that you actually maybe have to mobilize a person to whatever that is. So I kind of have a daisy chain effect, and I'll talk through that at the very end of what our reality is. I know this is a hard concept, so please don't hesitate to ask questions about it.
And there's lots of questions of this on the test, because it's one of the main focuses of NENA.
I give another example to illustrate. We had several different isolation events in the PSAP I was in New Mexico, and one of them was the air conditioner in the central office went out. The equipment overheated and the whole central office went defunct. 3 separate end offices all went into condition 4 routing. So we had to send dispatchers to each of those 3 areas to answer calls from a local phone within the service area of each of those end offices.
We had to send them to the islands.
Had to send them to the islands. 2 of those, the condition 4 routing worked automatically, the 3rd one didn't, and we never did get a very good explanation from, it was Quest Communications at the time, as to why the condition 4 routing didn't work. So you hope it works, you plan for it to work, but you also plan what to do in case it doesn't work and who to contact, as Kimberly found out too.
Is there a delay once CenturyLink does the condition 4 programming, whether it's automatic or manual? Is there a delay before that really becomes effective?
No,
Or is it pretty much
it was pretty much immediate. They have to sync a database. So whatever that sync time is, if they have to do it manually, it's like, okay, I'm gonna program it, I'm gonna hit sync, and I'm gonna sync that database, and then it was there. If it's automatic, it's supposed to say, okay, here's my path, I don't have a path, okay, here's my path. It's supposed to be pretty seamless, and then all of a sudden that red phone rings, and you're going, or that special number that you've got programmed in the Viper, that special line. So ours are programmed back up 911. It's actually labeled backup 911, so we know if that line rings, if it happens to be automatic, then we're on an isolation. An isolated.
And it's going through your Viper labeled backup 911?
Yes.
Nice.
It is. Okay, so the next one is my 4th and 5th category. So I talked about 5 and then I combined 4th and 5th, and I'm going to talk about the loss of tandem switch or selective router results in a loss of call routing and ANI service. So a loss of call routing and ANI service. You also will lose your ALI database. You're not going to get ALI on calls. You're going to lose, you can also lose an ALI node, which means your PSAPs are unable to get an ALI query. And you can also, in this scenario, even though your ALI circuit is not here, your ALI circuit is located wherever your phone system or wherever your demarcation is, you can also lose your ALI circuit, and that can impact your ALI bit as well. So for us, our selective routers, we've got 6 of them in Colorado. There is a PUC written report that kind of goes through Colorado specific stuff. You don't need to know that for the test. What it states in the NENA manual, it talks specifically about, it's very critical for all of this to be redundant. I mean, so that, obviously, we have to trust our provider, whoever our provider is that does the selective routing, who has the database for ALI, where the database is located, that there's physical separation, no single point of failure, and redundancy. So the key around this is all of those pieces, your ALI circuits that are your responsibility where they're located, that they're redundant. So we've got 4, I've got 5 PSAPs, but in our county we've got 2 demarc points and they're redundant. I've got 2 here and 2 here physically separated. Their responsibility is that if you were to lose your selective router database, that it would automatically roll over to the one located at Capitol Hill. And if they were to lose something on the western slope, it would automatically roll over. So that the design is that there's no single point of failure in these critical services, that if it's down, it's a loss of routing, it's a loss of call routing, your ANI service, loss of ALI database, loss of that whole node. All right. This particular piece is not in your book, but this is reality, and this is a little bit about what Darryl was talking about. You can have a situation where an end office is not what we call a standalone end office. Means it gets its brains or part of its function from a central office. So there's a standalone end office, and there's also remote end offices. Okay, so this is getting a little bit into more detail than you need to know for the test. It's not, I don't see it covered anywhere on the NINA website, but it is a reality, so it's kind of good background. So if you want to tune me out or go to the restroom at this time, you can do that. But if you were to lose the connectivity, trying to find my mouse right here, between the central office and the end office, you're gonna have your island, right? You're gonna have your little red circle around the end office, and you're gonna have your red circle. This may not have a red circle, this may be fine, but this is definitely gonna be isolated. Because if this end office cannot operate standalone, then it's dependent on the central office. You can also have what we call a remote end office. So this is that daisy chain effect, where you lose one, you lose the other, you lose the other. If I lose my connectivity way down here between my central office and my end office, I've isolated this end office. I've cut off anybody served way down here at that remote end office. So right here, this X has now impacted a community that may be served by a remote end office miles and miles and miles away. And they're isolated and they've got no service. And you're focused down here going, well, I had just a fiber cut down here. So this is that piece of really understanding who is served by what, who has a central office, who has an end office, who's got a remote end office. Does that make sense?
Not to me.
No, that's fine.
I guess for me, I need like some sort of geographic example
Okay.
of what the difference is between standalone or remote end office, I guess.
Yep, you bet. So here's an example. Let's pretend the central office is Fort Collins. So I've got two central offices located in Fort Collins. I've got one central office in Fort Collins that serves an end office in Wellington. And then I have a remote end office that's tagged off of this end office that serves Red Feather Lakes. I don't know if you know our county well enough to know, to kind of picture that.
I know where Wellington is.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what happens is if it's a daisy chain effect, so you really have 1, 2, and 3. 3 is dependent on 1, 2 is dependent on 1. Okay, so here, if you lose something in that connectivity to 2, 3 is impacted.
Gotcha.
Does that help a little bit? I mean, this, like I said, this is just kind of complicated. I have another one from the flood. You can look at this as Loveland. This central office is Loveland. This is Estes Park, and this is Allens Park. So the Allens Park community has a remote end office. Their services was tied to our end office in Estes Park. So when we started restoring fiber, the fiber wasn't strong enough and restored in that community that if we would have turned everything back up to get down to the Selective Router database, their citizens wouldn't have had 911. We had to finish restoring everything to make this end office work. So think about Loveland, Estes Park, Allens Park. And I don't know well enough to think, maybe you can think of Greeley. Obviously, I think you've got 2, maybe 3 central offices here. Windsor probably hasn't, they have an end office that pulls off of Greeley's. And I don't know, I know it's small because we had to do some research on it. It does not serve a lot of citizens, so it's an end office. Now, I don't know if there's another end office that is in Severance. That's probably too close to Windsor. What's north of that would be Nunn and Alt. So if you lose something in Greeley, you may impact Nunn or Alt.
Yeah.
Okay, if you lose something in Windsor, and Nunn and Alt is tied off of Windsor, if you lose Windsor, you may lose Nunn and Alt.
So when you're enacting condition for,
Condition for routing,
you talked about a 7-digit number.
right?
Do you, like, so if the central one goes down, do you need a different condition for routing number for the end office, the remote one, and the central?
You got it.
Okay.
So the question was, do you need a number, a condition for number for this central office that connects maybe to this PSAP? Something that's local to this island, yes. Something local to this island, yes. And then you would need something local to that island. Has to be local to that remote end office, so you would have to have a number in none.
Okay.
And if that number in none is local to none and you don't have a facility there, that's where Daryl was mentioning, you may have to point it to a fire station, someone's house. I mean, it can get kind of crazy in these rural areas with some of these remote end offices. So in our situation, in Red Feathers, we actually have that condition for routing pointed to Red Feathers Fire Station. So if we were in that, I have to have the county page the chief at home and say, tone out or tone in, we need someone to go staff that, because 911 calls for your little community are gonna be ringing there at that fire station. And then it's, you know, the firemen, the volunteer fire folks that are gonna be answering that phone line, unless we can get a county dispatcher over there.
So condition for routing is like the backup infrastructure for end offices and central offices, and it's a completely different infrastructure?
Than ours, yes.
Okay.
If we don't control it, yep, we can't control what they do in their end offices and how they set it up.
Okay.
We can't make it more resilient, we can't
But it's
really,
separate.
it's separate than ours, yep.
Okay.
Well, separate meaning we can't control it, but I'm gonna get to that point.
Okay.
Okay, any more examples? Because I really wanna make sure you understand this piece. This is a pretty big deal, not, you know, like I said, this is my local still talking about remote end offices, because they don't talk about that in the manual, but that is our reality in Colorado. They do hit home on central offices, end offices, condition for routing. The piece for us is that a remote end office could be tied, so if you break the chain anywhere between 1 and 3, you break at the very end.
Oh,
All right. So, it's black for a reason. So now this is like the quiz. So what happens when everything goes dark? And that's what we're going to talk about. Because we're going to try and tie everything together, and now it's dark. And I'm going to tell you, I'm not one to be scared of the dark, but man, I was scared when we flooded. And when we were sitting there, the team of us, and I had my whiteboard out, all the things, it was, we've got nothing. And I've got the chief texting me going, Kimberly, we've got nothing. We've got nothing. Can you get this? Are you getting this? We've got nothing. So what happens when you go dark? Single points of failure. The FEMA, think about the FEMA piece, think about all of this. And I'm going to talk about stuff that's out of the book, real life example, but tie it back to the book. So hang with me. Does anyone want to break before we go into that? How are we on time?
we are at 2:01. Does anybody need a break?
Do you want like a 5-minute break before we dive in? You're all, she's nodding yes.
Okay.
Why don't we do that? Why don't we take about just a 5-minute break,
Okay.
and then we're going to go from
No. Jim Zimmerman was on there at the beginning and he dropped off before we got started, so.
So we don't have anyone on there?
No, Gina from City of Lakewood.
Okay, she stayed.
Yeah.
Okay, so I
The
have to keep
Loveland
talking.
usually has about 8 people behind their one person that logs in.
And we don't have anyone from Loveland today.
It's scary, that means something happened.
I think anything was happening before we left. You guys are checking your phones, so we're okay, right? Yeah.
So how do we obtain those central end office?
You have to sit down with them and give him your firstborn. So wait till he's a teenager and give him away.
Or I have my second one.
Yeah.
So you need to sign a non-disclosure agreement. First, you just tell them you want to. You want to look at the maps. They may make you drive down to the Public Utilities Commission and actually sit at the PUC with PUC staff to do it. That's how I did it. Is I actually looked, I set up a meeting with the PUC staff. I filled out my NDA and sat there and we went through all the maps to understand my service area and all of the single points of failure.
They let you take that information, or do you have to retain it yourself?
You can take notes off of it, but you cannot take the maps that they give you.
Okay.
I mean, they didn't give me maps. It was, here's a big map, you know, it was like roll out kind of, this is the best way we can paint the picture for you, Kimberly. So they came prepared. They brought a huge map that I just took notes. So what was tricky is that it's concerning enough that you want to talk about it and want to share it with my board in a board meeting, but you can't because it's an NDA. But you can take that internal knowledge, know about it, knowing you can't control or change their single points of failure, but it may help you make different decisions on backup plans, backup processes, procedures that you may want to do. It's just good to know.
You want some water or something?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Sit down for a bit.
We're only taking a 5-minute break.
Oh, get back on, get back on.
I don't want to get comfortable because then, you know, see, you're gonna wait for 2 more.
In my case, the single point of failure became painfully obvious because we had like 3 different isolation events that were all caused by hunters shooting the overhead lines between Farmington, New Mexico and Albuquerque. That was our only connection to the outside world. And after the first time it happened, Quest said that they would fix it. After the second time it happened, I issued a press release. The third time it happened, I issued a press release, and then they fixed it. Because it became too embarrassing for them not to do something about it.
I'd be embarrassed to be the hunter shooting
Oh, they were having
the
fun.
animal in the line.
See, one of the scary things for us here in Weld during the flood is that we don't know who was isolated because CenturyLink never, they were too busy with the other
Big picture.
counties that we were never told
Yeah, that's a big question.
if we had an outage or not.
How do you recognize your?
I think we did because they never responded to my request. So it's like, we're not gonna tell you now, it's all up now.
We didn't know we had a community, so we get the benefit of the conversation. We didn't know that we had a community that was isolated and they were actually dark, so the outage was local and they couldn't make phone calls from your house out, so you were isolated from that location. And we did not have that information, so as we were standing up services and restoring services, we were surprised to learn we had this entire community around the Carter Lake area, if you're kind of familiar with Carter Lake is. So you have that whole community from Highway 34 down to Lyons that didn't have any phone service. And we had no idea, because the citizens knew we were working on it, we were putting out press releases, we were working on it, we were restoring services, we were focusing on Loveland, and we were focusing on County Road 56, and some of these other areas that got washed out really bad. It wasn't until the sheriff called me on a Saturday morning going, what the heck? What is going on? What's the status of this area? And I said, what do you mean they don't have phone service? I had no idea. CenturyLink didn't disclose to me, give me a list of all the outages and all the outage areas.
How do we avoid that?
Well, we fight, we make a voice, and we stand together, and we argue, we go to the PUC, and we file dockets, and we complain, we demand service level agreements, we demand communication. We have to be more active and more vocal as a NILink community to say that this is critical information, and we must know. Not that we would like to know, we must know, and I've tried for a year, and I'm not making headway, but it's me trying with a few other people. It's not all of the authorities across the state of Colorado and all of the PSAPs across Colorado standing together saying this is critical information. When we have an outage in a community, it could impact us, it could impact my ability to reach them on an emergency alert. I wanna know because I may have to send deputies to go door to door. You know, that's been my thought process to them is you don't understand how we would use that information. Give us the information. And then if we discard it, we discard it, but we may find value in it. Don't tell us what we'll find value in or what we won't find value in. So it's been a battle if you want to join the cause. I welcome you to join my cause as I file these dockets and nasty letters at the PUC. Okay, so we're dark. And Val wanted me to turn off the lights to make everybody scared. But we won't. Okay, so here's my reality. This is what we're gonna talk about, what really happened in Estes Park. So you see a lot of X's. I'm gonna talk through this map, and if you want another one to draw on, feel free again. This is Loveland Central Office, and this is Loveland PSAP. My project that I started years ago in Larimer County was to regionalize, even though we're 5 PSAPs. So all that equipment was regionalized, meaning instead of having 5 separate systems, we built our own private 911 ESI net, and we stood up half of a back room at Loveland, and the other half of the back room at Fort Collins, and then the other 3 PSAPs were pulled off of kind of half. So you've got your Viper here, and then you have your backup PSAP that, I don't know if it has another Viper node, I think it does. So you kind of did the same thing with your primary and your backup. I just did that on a little bit of the larger scale with 5 PSAPs. So I created my own little, we're gonna back each other up, it's gonna be lovely, and we're gonna take each other's load, and we're gonna, if you're too busy, we're not gonna wait for the rollover, we're just gonna be able to have those calls ring in on a threshold. So we created this whole private ESI net, and we installed brand new equipment countywide to support this concept. And you talk about testing, you test and you run all these disaster drills, and so that's what we have before the flood, okay? So this PSAP, Loveland PSAP, again is connected to Estes Park through conduit in the ground fiber along Highway 34, and that's my private ESI net. When we lost 34, we lost that fiber. You remember those pictures early on? So we lost that fiber, so that was gone. So Estes Park was isolated from the brains of the system. They were supposed to still be able to operate in a standalone Viper environment, okay, from the big picture. We also lost the connectivity from the central office to the end office. What we didn't know, was never disclosed to us, is that that fiber conduit is actually the exact same. It was the exact, they used to build my private ESI net, the same fiber that they were running and connecting the end offices to in the same conduit. Separate fiber pair, I hope, but in the ground. So we lost the brains in our 911 system, which we tested and we thought we can operate, we got a plan for this, but we lost and isolated that end office. When we lost that end office, we also had flooding locally to the citizens, and they lost all their connectivity to that end office. We had roads washed away, so citizens were literally being rescued from boats out of their houses, and canoes and all of that, floating down the streets trying to get to high ground and get rescued. Others were rescued from helicopters. We had thousands that we helicoptered out. So we lost from the citizen to the end office, so the citizens couldn't dial. We lost this path down to the Selective Router database, down to Broomfield and to Cap Hill. Now, the physical path that takes is still a bit confusing to me, even looking at all the maps, but it's not really along Highway 36 and Highway 7, but it's down in that vicinity, the way it goes, the way the fiber goes. And we lost, as you know, with all that flooding in Lyons and in the Boulder area, that was gone. So we lost all of that. This is the remote end office in Allens Park area, so that's the Allens Park piece. So we lost, when we had all the issues here, we lost all the connectivity. This fiber got washed away on Highway 7, where Lily's Lake area is, if you can picture that, Rocky Mountain National Park entrance area, and so that was gone, and we lost all of that fiber. We also, not fiber in the ground, they say don't call it fiber, we lost the connectivity, whether it was analog or fiber. We also had a T1 line from the end office to Estes Park PSAP, and that T1 line was for their PBX administrative lines. At one point, we had 911 trunks that would go from the end office down to the Selective Router database, back up to the PSAP, but we changed our DMARC when we changed that project, so we could always get 911 calls, even if we had a problem locally. But that didn't happen here because we couldn't get out of the end office down to the selective router. Okay, so the T1 meant our PBX didn't work, so we lost our PBX as well, because they relied on that T1 to connect the end office to the PBX locally at the police department building.
Can you say that again?
Do you want me to walk through all of it?
Just that T1 line part.
Yeah, so the T1, and Ed, you can correct me if I'm wrong on the T1 piece of it.
Okay, if I think you're wrong.
Okay, because I know you had conversations with Bruce specifically. So there's a T1 line that would connect for the police department, connect to the end office, to their PBX located here at the PD. They had a T1 line for that connectivity for all of their lines. For their VoIP lines, they also had a couple of analog lines, and they communicated to their end office over a T1 line. And they lost that connectivity too. Did I state that clear enough? Okay. They lost that connectivity.
And they weren't on the island, so they couldn't connect.
We lost any ability to even talk out of that island. Because you can't get out of an office. So we had lines that were not connected into the PBX. They're standalone lines, so something to think about. You don't have your backup condition 4 line tied to your PBX, because if you lose your PBX and you're on an island. So we actually at all of our centers have other phone lines that have nothing to do with the PBX, because you don't want to have only lines in your Viper from your PBX. You need to have CenturyLink lines or Comcast lines or something outside of your PBX. So we had that. So our condition 4 routing number actually wasn't tied to the PBX, which was great. It was actually tied to our analog fax line. So we thought, we don't care that you lost your T1, why is our condition 4 not working? Because that phone should be ringing, our fax phone sitting right here should be ringing, and we should be able to answer it. And what we found is that they never programmed those numbers in the end office. They needed to manually program it. They had the number on the wall, taped to the wall, but you couldn't physically get to that building because it was washed away. So the building was there, but the road all around it, they couldn't physically get to it. So they tried to get out of their house. We had a local tech. Tried to get out of his house, and he had to turn back because it was too dangerous to get there.
So this is a good example of having an automatic.
Right. So to this day, I have no idea which end offices, which central offices are automatic and which are manual. I don't have that answer from CenturyLink.
So it has to do with whatever equipment they have in each of those offices.
How they programmed them. Okay. So we see all of our points of failure. So what was our responsibility behind the demarc? Our responsibility was the PSAP, obviously, the equipment at the PSAP, and we thought we took care of that with building that node and that environment and the hosted. We had no idea that this green path and this purple path were the same. We would have made smarter choices if we would have known that. We probably would have done overhead from Platte River, Power Authority. We would have said, wait a minute, we were never told that. We never asked either for, fault here. I never said to them, where's physically that conduit and what else is in there? I just assumed through all of the discussions and all the comments about diversity, no points of failure, that that's what they truly meant. So even with the documentation, it's like, well, we do have diversity and no points of failure, but on their side of the demarcation, you can't truly see what that looks like. So another example, this network, this private ESI net, we have everything redundant Cisco routers, redundant power supplies. Ed worked really hard on making sure there was no single points of failure on our side of the demarcation. We recently received notice from CenturyLink that we're gonna have an outage here because they needed to take that fiber down. They needed to reset a card in the core, is what they said. And why would a card reset in the core of your network, the cloud stuff I don't like, take down my PSAP or isolate my PSAP? And their response was, I know we said there would be diversity and on separate cards, but that costs too much money. We don't have enough customers in Estes Park to justify it, so we haven't gotten around to purchase that other card. But if you wanna chip in an extra
$1 million.
40,000, then we'll have a second card in the core of our network. So even though all of this stuff has happened, you can't see what's on their side of the DMARC. So you are responsible for your side, but unfortunately, they create single points of failure for us. They, not picking on CenturyLink, they being our vendors. You know, our vendors can create that. So the big key here is making sure if you have a situation when you're on an island and you have that red circle around, that you know what condition 4 routing is, and you've got those numbers programmed. If you have an isolation that you understand, if at this point it's isolated or the connection's broken here, it may impact everything upstream. And when we couldn't get out to the selective router database, even if this connection was restored, if we couldn't get out here, we wouldn't have been able to route 911 calls. Because we can't get out to the selective router database, and that's the routing of the 911 calls.
So when they reset the card, did you lose Estes Park again?
Well, because of our Viper, so our previous vendor was Microdata, and after the floods, we ripped them out, so we took them out because they also failed in their performance. Even though we had tested and did all those things, they did not perform the way that they were supposed to in a disaster, and we replaced it with the Viper. So what happens with the Viper now, if Estes Park is on an island, then the only thing is that their 911 calls, they're on an island, okay, not any of this. So if they're on an island, their 911 calls get answered at Larimer County. PSAP as their backup because they come to our DMARC and our DMARC says, I can't get out to you, I'm gonna route you to your backup PSAP. But we're on a shared CAD system, so then they communicate over the CAD. So the Viper has proven, and we got to put it into play, to work correctly. So, my practical connection. I'm going to walk through the first step. I'm going to back us all up. That initial assessment, floods in Colorado, they were widespread. It was a regional, if not a state impact. So remember when I talked about the first thing you do is you think about the disaster. It was a natural disaster. It was widespread, high probability. We announced that it was going to have a high probability of loss of life and infrastructure. Then we did an impact analysis. PSAP, volume, PSAP volume control, personnel, can they get in? Can they even get into work? And if they get in, can they get home? So we had to do that impact analysis, and we had to look at, this wasn't just us, our backup PSAP and some of them, well, you guys were impacted, Boulder was impacted, so all of us were in trouble. It was much greater than even our county. And that we also, the impact was gonna be infrastructure and local equipment loss. And we did lose equipment in that piece as well. And I know this is hard to see, so from a mitigation perspective, these are the mitigation steps that we took. We purchased a 911 network that allowed each of our centers to seamlessly back each other up. So if you were to look at the FEMA emergency management perspective, our mitigation was we had that 911 network, we purchased the CPE equipment, and we had our emergency notification system, so we purchased all of those. Is that me or is that?
I think it's
Okay.
I think it's your wireless mouse.
Another mitigation is zoning. So we talked about like cutting the trees down. Loveland has amazing zoning that never allowed homes to be close to the river. So that when the river rose at the 500-year floodplain, they had never allowed anybody to build in those areas. And so that's all part of mitigation, okay? And then from a preparedness perspective, it's all of that training on each other's calls, how to take each other's backs up if they roll to another PSAP, your backup PSAP, that's all of that training, the testing, and all of that public education. Are you registered? If you lose infrastructure on landlines, are you registered on cell phones so we can still alert you if you need to? So that's being prepared, going out and doing all those training initiatives. And those vendor relationships, when I mentioned earlier, having all those vendor relationships in place. So if you need to reach out and touch someone you know who, and if I needed to call the president and beg and plead and explain how desperate we were, I knew who to call and how to do that. And then the next piece, putting into play, would be the response. That would be how we responded. The dispatch centers put their folks on 12-hour mandatory, everybody all hands on deck, 12 on, 12 off shifts. Lita went in to help back up and actually send a lot of the emergency alerts. Lita was also staged at the EOC. We were having media briefings. We were trying to tell people what to say with the media briefings. We talked about that. They were doing evacuee briefings, so that's the preparedness, practical connection of what you would do. We also immediately contacted pictometry and said, we're gonna need you to fly again. We flooded, we're gonna have damage, we need to get this contract going right away because we have so many houses that washed away. We need to do more imagery. And from a recovery perspective, that's your FEMA, that's your rebuilding. County assessors played a really big part in that from recovery, saying, okay, here's the assessing of the property and just being part of that whole communication process. Right, almost my final. You didn't die, so we didn't do death by PowerPoint. But this is a key point. It is in your manual, and it will be on your test, at least one question. And I'll buy you a cup of coffee if it's not. It's the TERT team, Telecommunicator Emergency Response Task Force. So know that definition. Nina does not tell you a lot about it, but they give you the website to go to read a little bit about it, and Abco and Nina fill the gaps for those areas that don't have a TERT team in place. The basic piece of that is a task force to provide assistance to PSAPs when they're overloaded in an emergency. So you're gonna wanna make sure that you read just a little bit up on it. Again, get familiar with what it means and the concepts. It's more or less, if you guys couldn't handle it, is there a team that would be called in to help back up, fill the gaps, do what you need to be done to make sure you're successful in your job.
Did you use the Colorado TERT team for the flood?
No.
You did,
Did they call you?
no, they don't call you, I'm gonna get closer to the mic. This is Debbie. I used them in Boulder for one of the major fires, and I called them. And it's a team of individuals who their PSAPs have allowed them to participate in this team, and they get to go. And you will be paid by your PSAP, so they letting you volunteer on this and get trained on this means you can go. And you will still be paid your salary, even if you're gone 12 days, you get paid all those hours by your PSAP. That's just helping your neighbor, helping each other. So I got a couple individuals from, I think, Grand Junction, and they come and they get their own hotel room, and they just are there for you. And what we did, we sent them out to where the Type 1 team was assembling and where the emergency command vehicles were. And they ran dispatch for that fire out there with one of our dispatchers. We didn't have enough staff and to do all of this, 24 hours, fill in all our workstations with 10 people. So we needed extra people. We thought they'd be better used in using their knowledge out at the command site. And that's where we used them. We used them for about 7 days, I believe. It was very useful, so it's something to keep in mind.
And we could have used them on the High Park fire. So from that exact example, from a High Park fires, we had a need to staff just to check people in, to check them out, to check resources, and CSU dispatchers actually filled that gap for the county because CSU wasn't impacted from High Park fire. And they volunteered and said, hey, we'll do that. We work the same CAD system, we'll take the notes, and we'll take that on for you. So that's a great, fire's different than flood. Flood, huge impact, fast impact, long recovery. Fire, long event, such a long event, and they just seem to, they grow, they get big, and then from fire, it always rains, and then you've got the flood. And so I could see a need of saying, hey, we're gonna need these folks for 7 days.
Does the FEMA website cover, I guess, what aspects you need to predict how much personnel you need?
No.
I mean, no?
Nope.
What, I mean, in your guys' experience, is there any sort of logical way of understanding or predicting?
How many people you're gonna need to fill the gap?
For any particular
Well,
emergency?
you're looking at, the additional 12 hours are crazy.
Yeah.
And there is no plan for that ever, even with by FEMA and the emergencies. The first 12 hours, forget it. Oh, sorry, that's me. But what you have to do is when you're in those 12 hours, you're preparing for your next operational period. So now you're looking at your staffing, and you're looking at your next 12 hours and beyond, and then you're gonna see, and then like Kimberly said, as the fire continues to get bigger, and you went from a type 3 team to, we skipped 2 and went to 1, it's huge. And now the feds are in town, and
And they
you're
take
getting all
over,
your, they
and-
take over, and you're doing a turnover, you're getting all your, the drops coming in, you get a lot of resources with a type 1 team. So, you know this is gonna go a couple weeks, and you better be looking at how tired your staff's getting, and can you have them out there, and the 12 on, 12 off works for a short period. 2 weeks is a long time, but sometimes it needs to happen, so you just, look at every operational period and plan maybe 2 beyond, kind of get an idea of how your staff's doing and where you're going. So there is no plan for that, it's very local, each PSAP does their own thing. And you know your people, like for the flood for us was amazing for me. Because we had just taken over for the county, and everybody could get in. We didn't have any people that couldn't get to work. Where Boulder reports, they have people that live in Loveland and Fort Collins, and they could not get into Boulder. Boulder was kind of isolated for a while too. And we were lucky that none of us, I think I was the only one that couldn't come in one day, because Frederick Firestone was flooded. But everybody else lives in Greeley, and if we would have lost this one bridge over here on 35th Avenue, we would have lost a lot of people, because then we needed helicopters to get in. But our PSAP was okay. We're high enough that we were okay. So it's just very localized, every PSAP does their own thing, and that's something about your preparedness is what does it look like and what do we do?
Can't get people in. We never could have predicted that we would have lost all access points in Estes Park except for Trail Ridge.
And believe it or not, after the flood, whether you guys thought you were prepared or not, you now have experience, and your next one is gonna be very different. Your next staffing, your next everything you need in an emergency.
And that's that mitigation.
Yeah.
Now you mitigate again. So that's when we talk that mitigation is first and last. After an emergency, you go back and go, didn't work so hot, that we need to start and do some different mitigation, or the landscape changes, and so you start to go through mitigation.
And if you're interested in knowing more about Colorado TERT, they have a Facebook page. If you go on Facebook and search for Colorado TERT, it should come up, and it's pretty interesting stuff.
I'm a really mean boss, you can ask my staff here. So I did develop a quiz for you, and we're gonna go through the quiz, and it's only 10 questions, so it should be simple. And we'll just answer it together, and we'll see how we do. How's that?
Good.
So, can you guys even see? You haven't been able to see my whole presentation, have you? You didn't even say anything. There are 4 groups of disasters. What is the right answer? Don't look at your books, don't look at your notes.
Sorry, I just don't understand where.
There are 4 groups of disasters: PSAP, secondary PSAP, regional, federal, localized, regionalized, PSAP only, network facilities. PSAP, localized, regional, state, localized, regional, state, federal. What do you think the answer is? You wanna say C?
Yes.
Should we say C? Alright. See if I can get this to work. Okay, next question. The 4 phases of emergency management are,
Was that the right answer?
well, we'll know at the end.
Oh.
We'll grade it. It will grade it at the end. The 4 phases of emergency management are response, recovery, recoup, regroup. I think everybody can read them, so throw out answers, so I'm not reading them all to you. You guys should move and participate. You have this.
B.
Everyone says B?
Say 2, yeah.
Consensus?
Yes.
We're gonna go off of consensus. Hazard analysis, an example of a natural threat would be severe weather, okay. A loss of service to the PSAP can require such action that personnel must be evacuated, never impacts dispatch personnel. Citizens will receive a busy signal if they dial 911, only impacts citizens in other communities. This is how your questions are gonna be. It's gonna make you think.
one of them can be right.
Could, maybe,
Yeah.
but it's not what it says
Say
in the
A
book.
or one.
You say A, okay. Is that consensus? Okay. Isolation of a central office is the question. What do you guys think the consensus is?
You mean they don't put island on the quiz?
Kind of good visual though.
Yeah, it is. I struggled with that when I studied.
Zoom in.
Can we, I don't know if we can zoom in, I'm sorry, I'll read them out loud.
Want me to dim the lights?
It says, so isolation of a central office allows calls to be rerouted to any phone number provided by the PSAP. Will not allow calls to reach the selective router. Allows calls to reach the selective router but does not allow calls to deliver Annie. Will not allow calls to be rerouted to any number when a citizen dials 911, they will receive a busy tone. This isn't allowed. Is that consensus?
Oh, no, no, no. What do you mean, A?
Doesn't allow it to the selective router.
Okay.
Was that what the consensus was B?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. TERT stands for Telecommunicator Emergency Response Task Force, Telecommunication Emergency Recovery Task Force, Task Force for Emergency Recovery of Telecommunicators, Task Force Emergency Response for Telecommunicators. And this is how the questions are. This is very similar, where you have to be careful and read the answers very carefully. When an isolation of an end office occurs, the communication links between the end office and the 911 network are interrupted. 911 calls will reach the selective router and reroute to the backup PSAP. No 911 calls will reach the selective router or Tandem and consequently will not reach the PSAP. 911 calls will receive a fast busy and cannot be rerouted under any circumstance. 911 calls will reroute the backup PSAP to a 10-digit number local to the backup PSAP. Again, we have an isolation of an end office and the communication links between the end office and the 911 network are interrupted. First or last?
You are, I think it's first. Yeah, four is last, right?
What are you guys saying, 4?
Is it 10?
I don't know, it's kind of.
I didn't hear you say anything, Robert.
If Annie
That's because I
fails,
was,
Still.
if Annie fails properly to the 911 selective router, call takers can expect to receive no impact will be experienced in the PSAP, no record found message, all zeros for the Annie, all nines for the Annie.
zero.
Right?
Yeah, I think so.
See that one frequently.
In anticipation of a central office isolation, what should be in place? Contact the PUC and ask them to implement rerouting. The calls will remain at the PSAP and no local impact will be experienced. An IGA for backup service and communication support with an alternative PSAP. Announce to the public that they should dial a 10-digit number in an emergency. You guys have just given up how to, you can take it at home, don't worry. This is what we do for fun at WADA, because I write quizzes for them. Seriously, that's what I've been doing.
Did you guys remember?
What's the IGA stand for?
Intergovernmental agreement?
Oh, there you go.
It's free?
Yeah.
Only 2 more questions. Default routing is, it's in the ESM programmed in the selective router database. Is the routing of calls across fiber for VoIP calls only? Is the number used to route calls used as a predetermined method to direct calls to the appropriate PSAP in case of an ANI or selective router failure? 4, that's the longest. 70%.
Wow.
We can. So,
Freeze.
it tells you the question and then, which ones you got wrong and
What's
which
the
ones you
correct
got
answer?
right.
okay, so that one's right, is that, or is the first one? Is it-
Sorry, I can't. It's wrong. Here, I'll try
The
this.
first one was wrong.
First one's wrong.
What was it?
I think I was wrong. Oh, no.
That was your answer, and then at the very end, the correct one was B. See how it's kind of grayed out and checked?
Oh, okay.
I was
So
gonna say.
there are 4 groups.
Nobody else said anything.
Those are the 4
I
groups.
picked
Remember,
C.
we talked about localized, regionalized PSAP network, it was early on, it was like the first 5
I know, I was
slides.
trying to remember what
Yeah.
it was.
So and what we can do, I don't know if we can print this out. Debbie, can we print this out maybe, and you can give it to everybody?
I might use your
It
thumb
might
drive,
be connected,
yes,
actually.
or.
Well, this is just on that computer.
Is it going to be on?
It's on the one that's up there.
It might
But
be
yeah,
connected
So
already.
he's
No,
made,
okay.
I
this
can
literally
post-
was installed today, the computer,
Oh, okay.
so
Look,
it
it's saved.
might or might not be.
So
We can post a link to the quiz.
we can, and I actually have a few other quizzes I created for my team. I just kind of went through the book and started creating questions. So if this group wants to ever go
Oh,
through
yeah.
quizzes like this,
Yeah.
One of
like
the things
quizzes
I was
way better
supposed
than
to do
flashcards.
is, I did a quiz and flashcards for the very first lesson, and then I haven't done it again, so the quizzes will help them study.
yeah, so let's see, we missed 1, you missed 7. When an isolation of an end office occurs, the communication links between the end office and the 911 network are impacted. The answer was no 911 calls will reach the selective router or tandem, and consequently they will not reach the PSAP because you have to have condition 4. So questions, you
that's
write
wrong.
things like that for a reason, because the book really breaks it down as they're not talking about condition 4. They didn't say anything about condition 4 in that question, right? So really think about it segmented and be careful when you take the test that you're only answering the question they gave you, not like, oh, but if you have condition 4, the PSAP can still get the call. Right, but they didn't say anything about that. They will in other places, but not on that question. Okay. The answer is no record found. If the ANI fails to transmit properly to the 911 selective router, call takers can expect a no record found. And that's it. And then, oh, this one, isolation of the end office. The answer was no 911 calls. Oh, we already covered that one. Okay. So that's not bad. You guys did good. So, good job. 3 out of 10. That's not bad. I don't remember what a passing grade is.
70%.
Okay, so you passed.
You barely
We can all
passed.
rejoice. So, do you guys have any other questions? I know it was a